It's become a typical day in Colombia. 3 more judges have quit their jobs after being threatened by the murderous drug cartels.
The Colombian drug barons, thought to be fleeing their government's crackdown, have made their presence felt with startling ferocity.
Colombia's drug lords responded today to the government's new Get Tough policy. They declared war on the government and launched a series of attacks that killed 1 person.
On the 31st of May, 2022, an 83-year-old cartel leader died in an American prison. But there wasn't any noise. Not the media, not the news. It was almost as if Gilberto Rodriguez Orejuela was a nobody. But he wasn't. He was El Adrejequista, the chess master, the one who brought the laws of commerce to the drug trade, the ultimate puppet master, who worked from the shadows, the man who waged war on Pablo Escobar and won. Gilberto was a narco-revolutionary, and today I'm going to tell you all about him. Who was this cartel leader who died in prison? Gilberto Rodriguez Orejuela was born on the 30th of January 1939 to a painter and a housewife. Like many of his contemporaries, including Pablo Escobar, Gilberto was introduced to crime from a very early age. However, unlike Escobar, he wasn't born poor. His family was middle class. Gilberto started his life in the Mariquita municipality of the Tolima department. Departments in Colombia are the equivalent of states in the US. Some years after the birth of his younger brother Miguel, his parents decided to move to the city of Cali, which was the capital of the Valle del Cauca department. Life went on just fine for the Orejuelas until, all of a sudden, Gilberto's father decided to leave the family. This decision plunged them into poverty. Their mother, who had never had a job and never needed to, suddenly found herself responsible for the upkeep of the entire family. Aside from Miguel, Gilberto had 4 other siblings, so it was a lot for the poor woman. Thankfully, Gilberto was aware, so despite the fact that he was just 13 at the time, he stepped up and took responsibility for his home. At the time, he was a student at the San Luis Gonzaga School, which sat in the heart of the capital. Gilberto got a job as a delivery boy running errands for a drugstore that wasn't too far from his school. His job description was simple: transport medication to elderly people who couldn't make the distance to the store. There are no records for how much Gilberto was paid and if this was what led him into theft, but like I established earlier, there was a necessity for survival, a necessity to return his life to the way things were. And when opportunity meets greed, criminals are born. In Gilberto's case, he began to diversify his clientele base. Beyond the assignment to elderly people, the young Orejuela stole drugs from his workplace and began peddling it at a markup price to addicts. This was the grand foreshadowing of what was going to be Gilberto's legendary narcotics career. Did Gilberto see this future from an early age? Did he already know this was the path he would take? Or was this new reality merely a consequence of his cruel fate? We will never know. What we do know is that Gilberto's younger brother Miguel was right beside him. They delivered the drugs together, stole together, and even shared the profits together. By his 20s, Gilberto had started his own drugstore, and with time, both brothers would become business partners of one of the biggest, most corrupt, and yet most influential cartels of the 20th century. But wait, we're getting ahead of ourselves. There were a lot of steps that needed to be taken first. Greatness, good or bad, takes time and a lot of effort. And in the case of Gilberto and his brother, the first step toward their dream life began with kidnapping and extortion. 1960s. Through the 50s, the Orejuelas were mostly missing in action. However, there is no doubt that they worked together during this period of absence, and there is also no doubt that it was deliberate, because when they would resurface in the 60s, they were established criminals. Gilberto now had a chain of pharmacy stores that bent the rules enough to maximize profit. Gilberto was well into his 30s, and rich. From Gilberto's perspective, they were not rich enough. Gilberto had ambition, but most importantly, he had a plan. A plan that drew something of a line between where he was at the start of the 1960s and what would eventually become the multi-billion-dollar cocaine traffic enterprise named the Cali Cartel. He and his brother teamed up with a mutual friend, a crook named Jose Santa Cruz Londono. Londono was, how to say this delicately, a resourcefully violent man. Some would say he had an appetite for certain extremities. Others would say he was a man who did what needed to be done. But whichever it was, there was no doubt that he was the perfect partner to Gilberto's next venture, Las Chemas. Las Chemas was a criminal organization that specialized in sabotage, smuggling, extortion, and kidnapping. The sabotage and smuggling went hand in hand. They targeted vehicles and dealt in lightweight contrabands like fabrics and whiskey. This aspect of their business was relatively safe, safe, but it wasn't profitable enough. Extortion and kidnapping, on the other hand, were very risky, and as a result, very lucrative. Thankfully, they had Londono on their side to oversee the grislier parts of the business. After almost a decade of running Las Chemas, Gilberto and his team hit the jackpot after kidnapping 2 Swiss citizens from a diplomat's family in Cali. Gilberto demanded $700,000 in ransom. They obliged. And today, many believe this amount of money, which was a staggering sum in the 1970s, was what facilitated Gilberto's next criminal enterprise. Because in the months that followed the ransom, Gilberto and his brother began to assemble a team that would come to be known as the Cali Cartel. The birth of the Cali Cartel, 1975.
It happens frequently, and it happened again last night. A cocaine arrest, this one at Miami International Airport. A Canadian accused of trying to smuggle 3 pounds of cocaine into this country in 3 pairs of platform shoes. Its estimated value on the streets, $700,000.
The 70s was epic for anyone who loved drugs. The decade ushered in cocaine with a rage, and soon it had surpassed coffee as the chief export in Colombia. By 1973, some guy named Pablo Escobar, not sure, but you might have heard of him, formed the Medellin Cartel. It is possible that it was this move that inspired Gilberto to branch into the trade. We will never know. But what we do know is that 2 years after the Medellin Cartel was formed, in 1975, Gilberto established the Cali Cartel, along with his brother Miguel, José Santa Cruz Londoño from Las Chemas, and Helmer Herrera. From the very beginning, Gilberto sought to differentiate himself from Escobar's enterprise. Unlike Escobar, he was far more educated and came from a more respectable social background, and thus didn't feel the need to prove anything to anyone. This allowed him to adopt a less flashy criminal persona, and it also allowed him to move between social classes without sticking out like a sore thumb. Meanwhile, Gilberto went to great lengths to differentiate his cartel from Escobar's enterprise. He nicknamed his cartel Los Caballeros de Cali, which translates to the Gentlemen of Cali. They tried to take a moral high ground, choosing to traffic the less damaging marijuana, but marijuana had low margins of profit and required massive amounts to be trafficked in order to cover the cost of resources spent, so it wasn't profitable from a business perspective. Eventually, they caved and began transporting cocaine, just like Escobar. It was Gilberto who sent Helmer Herrera to New York City to establish a port for distribution. It was easy. Why? Well, because the US government didn't see cocaine as a real problem in the 70s. They were too busy dealing with heroin, which had already had a very problematic reputation in the States.
Hank is a real hype, a hooked mainliner beyond hope. He is long past getting any kicks from marijuana. His body is conditioned to heroin, one of the most powerful, dangerous drugs known to man. So dangerous that its importation, even for medical uses, has been banned in the United States since 1925.
Another way that the Cali Cartel differed from Escobar's Medellin was through its structure. While Medellin was centralized, with everyone beneath Escobar answering to him alone and paying taxes directly to him, the Cali Cartel was divided into 5 groups that were further subdivided into several other cells. Everyone had their own shop called cells and could make their own decisions without having to consult Gilberto. Gilberto's job was to lay out the vision, check any excesses, and collect his cut. Over time, the older Orejuela came to be deeply respected for his knack for strategy. He was always in touch with the bigger picture, a master of the chess game of the world of business.
He is very smart person. He is so-called the ajedrecista. You know the ajedrecista, chess player, because he is careful, he acts carefully.
His younger brother Miguel was better suited for the daily operations and dealings. With Londoño and Herrera already on the team, Gilberto recruited more members that he trusted, and with time they were controlling a cocaine distribution network that stretched from Los Angeles, Miami, and New York City to the very heart of the Soviet Union. These men were Gilberto's associates. Under each of them, a complex web of multiple cells ran independently under managers who remitted royalties to Gilberto, his brother, and his associates. This made business more fluid, but more importantly, it insulated the bosses at the top.
Those involved in transport don't know the distributors don't know the money launderers, and none of them, theoretically, know the drug bosses in Cali.
And business boomed. Under Gilberto's guidance, the Cali Cartel found inventive methods of exporting massive quantities of the hard drug, one of which was by hiding them in thick wooden planks that were shipped from the port of Buenaventura on Colombia's Pacific coast to various warehouses and shell companies in the United States. Now, it wasn't as if Cali had no enemies in the 70s. They definitely did. In fact, international authorities had begun discovering shipments as far back as 76, when 290 kilos of coca paste was seized before it left Peru for Colombia. And in 78, the US would hop on the train of suspicion when federal agents uncovered a cocaine distribution network in Queens, New York, which belonged to Gilberto. But you see, what kept Gilberto off their radar was the unique way he operated. Unlike Escobar, who had oversized political ambitions, Gilberto was okay with being a kingmaker from the shadows. And unlike Escobar, who waged war on government officials who didn't give him what he wanted, Gilberto found a way to ensure his offer was one they would never be able to refuse. Threats of violence almost always ended in threats, and threats from a man as formidable as Gilberto were almost always enough to get things done.
Oh, they have great investments in Colombia. I would say that they are among the greatest investors in this country. They invest in banking, construction, industry, agricultural development, etc., etc., etc.
By starting and investing in so many banks and other financial institutions from Colombia to Panama, Gilberto built a smokescreen of influence around himself and his cartel. He was practically the narco angel investor of the 1970s. Those who could be bought were bought, and those who couldn't had the roofs over their heads taken forcibly. And at the end of a long day's work, while Escobar had a fleet of cars and a zoo in his palatial mansions, Gilberto drove in a low-cost car that your average government worker would drive to a home that was located in an upper-middle-class neighborhood that your average government worker might live in. Unholy unions, 1980s. By the early 1980s, the Cali Cartel were responsible for 20% of the world cocaine market, and Gilberto had done all of this from the shadows, building the Cali Cartel into one of the most discreet yet successful drug trafficking organizations in the world. Their only competition was the Medellin Cartel, who still had the lion's share and controlled the remaining 80%. Under Gilberto's leadership, the Cali Cartel had their own routes, their own markets, and through Gilberto's philosophy of diplomacy before violence, they eventually found a way to spread their net of influence by partnering with the Medellin Cartel. Let's be frank, Gilberto and Escobar weren't friends. And it's not just because Escobar was his direct competitor, it was because Pablo was the complete opposite of everything Gilberto was and stood for. However, Escobar was undeniably successful, and Gilberto wasn't prepared to go to war with him. It would destabilize both cartels, their businesses, and the global drug trade. It would also draw undue attention from the authorities. So they teamed up, divided up the major United States distribution points. The Cali Cartel took New York City, and the Medellin Cartel took South Florida and Miami. This stabilized the drug market in the early 1980s and opened the door for more collaborations. Unfortunately, this alliance from hell had its drawbacks, because by becoming Escobar's ally, the Cali Cartel inherited Escobar's enemies. You see, in the 80s, after Escobar, rather unwisely, tried and failed to get into Colombian politics, he waged a vicious war on their government. This became the recipe for Gilberto's worst nightmare, because it drew in America's attention and forced government policy to be entirely focused on tackling cartels. So Gilberto began to look for insurance for himself in alternate, untapped markets, and he found it in Europe. Gilberto formed alliances with the notorious Italian mafia organization La Camorra and established a system of cocaine transport and distribution in Europe through Italy with the mafia's support. At some point, it was safe to say that he was responsible for almost every grain of coke sniffed in Europe. And till today, you can probably draw a straight line between the Cali Cartel and anyone who currently has a drug problem there. Meanwhile, Pablo's methods didn't go down well with Gilberto. But again, like I said, he had made a choice and wasn't about to back down just because of some violence to some already violent people. Unfortunately, by the mid-80s, their testy alliance began to crumble. On the one hand, the competition between the two cartels became too fierce to contain, and other smaller cartels began to exploit the problems this caused. Eventually, it was a close ally of the Medellin cartel that triggered their parting. Rodriguez Gacha, also known as El Sombrero, attempted to move in on the New York City market, which had already been ceded to the Cali cartel with Escobar's blessing. Then in 1984, Gilberto was with Jorge Ochoa, a close associate of Escobar in Madrid, when they both got arrested. Ochoa's arrest planted seeds of suspicion in Escobar's mind, and when Ochoa remained in prison after Gilberto was released a year later, their relationship fractured. Throughout Gilberto's incarceration, America pressured the Spanish government for his extradition, but Gilberto's lawyers were able to convince the government of Colombia to pressure the Spanish head, Felipe González, to deport him to Colombia in 1986. In Colombia, Gilberto was transferred to the Bella Vista prison in Cali, where he served another 13 months. However, this is where Gilberto's influence began to show up for him. Prosecutors were more than ready to bring down Gilberto, because they knew it would be a massive blow, if not the end of the Cali cartel. They even opened an investigative process that would have indicted Gilberto for drug trafficking, but in 1988, the entire case was thrown out due to a supposed lack of evidence. Gilberto was acquitted. He was once again a free man, and immediately after Gilberto stepped out of jail, he stepped back into the shadows. However, his cover was already blown and his days were numbered, because while he now moved in the dark, the US government followed him closely with a spotlight. Meanwhile, a war was brewing. Cali versus Medellin. As the 80s drew to a close, Pablo Escobar became radioactive. He had already murdered a sitting minister, Minister Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, in 1984. This act of narco-terrorism caused the presidency of Cesar Gaviria to move against him. International attention, specifically from the US, was also drawn towards Escobar and the Colombian drug trade. At some point, Escobar was fighting a war against the government, extradition, and the press. In 1986, he ordered the assassination of Guillermo Camo, who was the director of the newspaper El Espectador, in order to intimidate any other journalist who thought of opposing him. And by the close of 1987, Escobar was demanding Gilberto to join him in terrorizing the country in order to force them to ban extraditions. And so, he declined the request. Escobar felt betrayed and declared war on him too. Things were now back to normal. Cali and Medellin, sworn enemies. Unfortunately for Escobar, he had underestimated the extent to which Gilberto was willing to play dirty. There would be no proxy war. They went out for each other's throats. As Escobar evaded authorities by moving from safe house to safe house, he sent assassins to take Gilberto's life. Stores belonging to Gilberto were bombed, money was lost, civilians died. But most of all, Gilberto was pissed. So he retaliated and went after Escobar's entire family. On the evening of Wednesday, January 13th, 1988, the Cali Cartel detonated a car bomb with 150 pounds of dynamite in front of the Monaco building in one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in Medellin. Pablo's family were in the building that evening. Luckily for them, they didn't die, but the bomb destroyed the neighborhood, shattering windows in a 4-block radius and killing 3 while injuring another 10. On another occasion, Gilberto employed a British commando named Peter McAleese to kill Escobar, but he failed.
Well, Escobar is not universally loved. He was the target earlier this year of an assassination attempt, one that involved British mercenaries. As ABC's Pierre Salinger reports, there is some mystery about who was behind it.
Hit after hit, miss after miss, Escobar remained evasive to both Gilberto and the government, but his power waned, and eventually he struck a deal that saw him build his own prison, La Catedral. But Gilberto wasn't done with El Patron. He tried once again to take Pablo's life by bombing the prison from the sky, but once again, he failed. However, Medellin as a whole was on the decline, and Cali was on the rise. For every territory that Pablo lost, Gilberto gained. For the first time, the cost of battling Pablo Escobar made economic sense. So Gilberto adjusted in his seat and put his money where his mouth was. This time, he would make sure that he didn't miss. The fall of the Cali Cartel. The 90s marked both the complete domination and the inevitable downfall of the Cali Cartel. In a very conflicting way, both events happened around the same time. In 1993, Gilberto and other heads of the Cali Cartel funded an organization called Perseguidos por Pablo Escobar, better known as Los Pepes. They were made of former members of the Medellin cartel who had been targeted for assassination by Escobar. Now, Los Pepes were out for revenge, and since their goals aligned with those of the Cali Cartel, Gilberto happily obliged to provide them with the resources necessary to bring an end to Escobar. The Cali Cartel contributed at least $30 million to Los Pepes. Meanwhile, the Colombian government had formed their own anti-Escobar organization called Search Block, a joint police and army unit specifically created to track down Medellin leaders. And it wasn't just the Colombian government that had gotten in bed with Los Pepes, the Americans were in on it too, which is ironic because in 1991, law enforcement agencies had seized 67 tons of cocaine, 75% of which was owned by the Cali Cartel. And in 1992, the US had tapped an associate of Gilberto, which led to the arrest of 6 of his business associates and the seizure of more than 13,000 pounds of cocaine that was hidden in a load of broccoli. Throughout 1993, the same year that they successfully made Escobar a past tense, the US Customs Service seized 12,000 pounds of cocaine from the Cali Cartel in Miami and intercepted 3 maritime ships that had a total of 37,000 pounds of the white substance. So, the Americans working with the Cali Cartel were there merely for necessity's sake. They weren't allies of Gilberto, they were a growing thorn in his backside. But their attacks were still relatively easy to ignore, because with Escobar dead, Gilberto cannibalized the drug market. El ajedrecista, the chess player, had moved his final piece. Checkmate. The Cali Cartel now controlled 90% of the drug trade. At their peak, they were making $7 billion a year. Do the math. Game over. Gilberto had won. So, what was next? Well, on the one hand, the Americans and the Colombians turned all of their resources towards dismantling the Cali Cartel and its leaders. especially Gilberto and his brother. In 1995, the US Treasury Department published a list of around 100 companies that were directly linked to the drug lord, his brother, and his cartel. They knew that the only way to legally hurt him was by destroying his public image and the facade of legitimate companies he had used to mask his drug empire. On another hand, Gilberto began to lose scope, just like Pablo Escobar. He wasn't trying to join politics, no, he was trying to control it. In that same year, intelligence agencies revealed that Gilberto was attempting a narco-democracy. In essence, he was trying to install the next president of Colombia. This damning piece of evidence was what presidential candidate Andres Pastrana Arango used to accuse the president-elect Ernesto Samper Pizano of receiving at least $3.7 million from the Cali cartel to finance his campaign. However, the investigations advanced by judicial authorities at that time determined that there was not enough evidence of drug money sponsoring Samper's presidential campaign and that he had knowledge of this fact. But even if it was true, Samper was now firmly under the spotlight, and if he had any alliances with Gilberto, he no longer had the liberty of preserving that relationship. He had to crack down on the drug lord. Between June and July of 1995, the remaining 6 of the 7 heads of the cartel were arrested, including Londoño. Banks, stores, schools, any facility remotely affiliated with the drug lord was shut down. On the 9th of June 1995, the walls eventually closed in on Gilberto when he was arrested by the Colombian National Police during a house raid in Cali. They had missed him days earlier when they searched his home because he was hiding in a hollowed-out bathroom cabinet with an oxygen tank. 2 months later, his brother Miguel would be arrested after getting betrayed by his main bodyguard, Jorge Salcedo. Gilberto was transferred to Bogota and sentenced to 12 years in prison, and confessing to some crimes, his sentence was reduced. From behind bars, Gilberto continued to pull the strings on his dwindling empire, but he was getting tired, like a man who had done it all. Gilberto was prepared to retire. In fact, it has been suggested that he facilitated his own arrest. As his sentence came to an end in the early 2000s, there was still a final, dreadful chapter waiting for him, a chapter that threatened his hopes for a peaceful retirement, because while Colombia might have gotten their version of justice, the Americans were still waiting in line. In 2004, after a brief release, the AG of Colombia ordered Gilberto's arrest once again. This time, it was for a specific case from 1990, where he sent 150 kilos of cocaine to the United States. The US pressured the Colombian government for his extradition, and in 2006, much to the horror of Gilberto, he was extradited to the US, where he was sentenced to 30 years in prison for conspiring to import cocaine into the United States and launder drug money. He pled guilty in Miami to charges of conspiracy to import cocaine into the United States, and after his confession, he agreed to forfeit $2.1 billion in assets. The agreement, however, did not require him to cooperate in any other investigations. He was solely responsible for identification of assets stemming from his cocaine trafficking. From that time till his death on the 31st of May 2022, Gilberto was held at the Butner Federal Prison. His legacy. Gilberto was built differently. Among his peers, he stood out, not awkwardly, but as a criminal who always had a plan. And it just wasn't for himself alone. Gilberto had planned out the future for his entire family, especially his children. He made sure that they weren't involved in the drug trade. He sent them to study in top American universities and made sure they were insulated from his criminal dealings. He knew his way of life wasn't sustainable, and he wanted no child of his to continue in it. In fact, when his first son got into jail for dealing drugs, Gilberto was so angry that he paid him a visit with a belt and flogged the grown man like he was an unruly 5-year-old. But then when Gilberto was asked how he felt about his life, he said he had no regrets. According to him, he lived well and he achieved everything he set out to achieve. And so, when he died, it spelled the end of an era, the first generation of Colombian narco-traffickers. But at the same time, it ushered in the birth of another era of Colombian traffickers. Have you ever wondered why you only hear of Mexican cartels in the news? For all the worship that Escobar gets in the Western world, the new age of Colombian drug traffickers have chosen Gilberto's path. They have perfected his low-profile approach to drug trafficking. They have fine-tuned his approach to infiltrate legitimate businesses and the higher echelons of power. If Gilberto were alive today, he would be proud of what they have achieved. He would be proud to know that this new age of drug traffickers are impossible to catch. He would be proud to hear them referred to as the Invisibles.
We will, for the first time, make available the appropriate resources of America's armed forces, and for the drug kingpins, the death penalty.